warmest of greetings to you. I am your storyteller, Chip, and this here is my friend, Elsie, the little camel. And have you ever wondered how Father Christmas delivers presents to really hot countries that reindeer don't like to go to? Well, at the start of this story, Elsie would not have been able to tell you. Because you see, at the start of this story, Christmas hadn't been invented yet. And also, even if Christmas had been invented, Elsie would have been on the naughty list. Because you see, Elsie and her family had the job of carrying people across the desert where it was hot and it was dry and it was dusty and look, cactus! And Elsie was always getting distracted. You see, Elsie really loved cactuses, and whenever they were carrying people through the desert where it was hot, can you imagine how hot it would be and how you'd look if it was hot? Yes, you'd be waving the sweat off your face, and it was dusty as well, so you'd have your eyes half shut because of all the dust, and it was dry, so you'd probably be panting as well. And look, cactus! Whenever she saw a cactus, Elsie would go over and she would inspect the cactus and she would sniff the cactus. She might even lick the cactus. And by the time she noticed the other camels, her mum and her dad and grandpa and grandma camel, they would all be several meters away. And when they looked back and they saw that Elsie was still with the cactus, they would all say, "Come on, little camel!" You could maybe even help them with that if you like. What would they say? "Come on, little camel!" And Elsie would turn around and she would have to chase after them. And of course, this would make them late, which would make Mummy and Daddy Camel very cross indeed. And as a punishment, this meant Elsie did not get any pudding. And she had to do all of the washing up, which she didn't mind too much because they only had dinner once a month. They were camels after all. But she also didn't get any toys. And she didn't have any friends that were allowed to come over. And so at the end of most days, poor Elsie would be sat in her stable feeling really, really unhappy. And her mum and her dad would come along and they would just say, "Good night, Elsie," and they would close the door. And Grandpa Camel would also come along and he would just say, "Good night, Elsie," and he would close the door. He'd be quite upset that they were late as well. But Grandma Camel would come in and see Elsie sitting there with a very sad look on her face and would say, "Chin up, Elsie, chin up." And Elsie would always think, "Chin up? Chin up? What do you want to put your chin up for? What's so good about the ceiling?" Elsie never understood that, but day in, day out, she would help her family with their job of carrying people through the desert where it was hot. Imagine how hot you could be again. And dusty. That's it, getting in your eyes. And also dry. Can you be panting? And look, cactus! And still Elsie would get distracted by the cactus. And all of the other camels would say, "Come on, little camel!" And Elsie would see that they were gone and she would chase to catch up and it would make them late. So Mum and Dad would be cross and Grandpa would be cross and Elsie would be there in the stable at night feeling really, really sad until Grandma Camel came along and said, "Chin up, Elsie." And then Elsie wouldn't be sad anymore. She'd just be confused, thinking, chin up? What do I want my chin up for? What's so good about the ceiling? Well, at the start of this story, Elsie woke up and came out to join the rest of her family. And in the stable, there were quite a lot of people. There were, in fact, some wise men. 12 of them. 12 wise men. 4 of them were riding on horses. 4 of them were riding on elephants. But the other 4 didn't have any animals to ride, so they were asking the camels if they could ride with them. And Daddy Camel, Mummy Camel, Grandpa Camel, and Grandma Camel all said, fine. But there was something else these wise men wanted to ask. They had lots of presents they wanted to carry through the desert as well, because they said they were going to see a new king who had just been born. And the presents they were carrying were gold and frankincense and... oh, I can't remember the last one. Can you remember the last one? What could the last one be? Oh, that's right. Myrrh. They had gold and frankincense and myrrh. And so they wanted to also have a camel to carry those presents. Guess what Elsie's job was going to be? Carrying all the presents. So all of that gold got put onto the back of Elsie. All of the frankincense got put onto the back of Elsie. All of the myrrh got put onto the back of Elsie. And it was very heavy, wasn't it? But with all of those presents on Elsie's back, and with all of the wise men on the backs of the other camels and the elephants and the horses, the wise men began trudging through the desert. And as they were going through the desert, it was hot. And it was dusty. Oh, getting in your eyes. And it was dry. And look, cactus! And Elsie saw a cactus, and she inspected the cactus, and she sniffed the cactus, and she even licked the cactus. And the other camels all turned around and said, "Come on, little camel!" And Elsie turned around and started trudging after them. But it was really, really hard to trudge as fast as normal because she had all of those presents on her back. And it was still really, really hot and really, really dusty. Oh, dearie me. And really, really dry. And look, cactus! And Elsie saw another cactus. So she went over to inspect it and sniff it and lick it. And by the time the other camels noticed, they were even further away. So when they said, "Come on, little camel," this time, it sounded a little bit quieter because they were further away. Do you think you can do it a little bit quieter? Like this. "Come on, little camel." And when Elsie heard, she turned around and she started trudging after them. But it was still really hard to get a good speed because of all the presents on her back. And it was still really hot. And it was really dusty. And it was really dry. And look, cactus! And Elsie found another cactus, which she inspected and sniffed and licked. And by the time the other camels noticed, they were so far away that their "come on, little camel" sounded a bit like a whisper. Do you think you can do that? Can you say it like a whisper? "Come on, little camel." And when Elsie heard them, she turned around and she tried to catch up, but it was so hard with all of those presents on her back weighing her down. And it was still really hot. and really dusty and really dry. Thank you, yeah. And cactus! And Elsie saw another cactus and she inspected it, she sniffed it, she licked it. And by the time she'd finished, the other camels didn't say anything. Because you're right, they were too far away. They were so far away now that they didn't notice how far behind Elsie had got. And by the time Elsie finished inspecting that cactus, when she turned around, she couldn't see any of the other camels anymore. She couldn't even see those huge elephants. She was so far behind. And Elsie began to get a little bit scared. But of course, this was the desert, wasn't it? Yeah. And in the desert, if you want to follow someone, all you need to do is look at the sand where you'll see their hoof prints. So Elsie was just about to start following the tracks that the others had left behind when the wind began to blow really strong. Can you make a loud blowing noise like the wind? It was a sandstorm, and all of the sand was rushing around in the air, and Elsie had to run into a cave to hide from all of the sand blowing around and getting in her eyes. And by the time the storm had gone away, the sun had gone away too. It was nighttime, it was very dark. There weren't any more hoof prints for Elsie to follow. And she was there, hiding in the cave. And while it can be really hot in the desert during the daytime, at nighttime, it gets really, really cold. And Elsie was beginning to shiver. Most of those shivers were coming from the cold, but some of them were also frightened shivers, because there in the night, she began hearing the sound of clattering. Can you make a kind of clicking sound like... That was the sound of scorpions creeping through the desert. She also heard the sound of some hissing. Can you make a hissing noise? Like that? That was the sound of snakes slithering through the sand. And she also heard, in the distance, the scariest sound of all. Laughter. Can you go... That was the sound of hyenas. And hyenas especially like eating little camels. So Elsie was hiding in that cave. She felt very alone. She felt very lost. She felt very scared. She felt so silly. She knew that her mum and her dad and her grandpa would all be really furious with her now because of how lost she'd got, and she might even get eaten by a hyena and no one would care. Oh, well, except maybe Grandma, because of course if Grandma could see her right now, Grandma Camel would be saying, "Chin up, Elsie." And Elsie thought to herself, "Chin up? What do you want your chin up for?" And when Elsie looked up, there in the sky, she saw the brightest star she had ever seen. A star that looked bigger than all of the others. It was almost so bright it could be like the sun. But when she saw that star, it lit up the way across the desert. And Elsie knew what she needed to do in that moment. She knew she needed to follow that star, because if she followed that star, it would take her to a little town. She could see a little town in the distance right underneath that star. So she thought if she followed that star and made it to that town, surely someone would be able to tell her where 4 camels and 4 elephants and 4 horses had all got to. So that's exactly what she started to do. She started to head across the desert, following that bright star. And even though she could still hear the clattering of scorpions, and she could still hear the hissing of snakes, and she could still hear the laughter of hyenas, she didn't feel so scared, because that star, that bright star, seemed to fill her with courage, make her feel extra brave as she was going through the desert. And eventually, she made it to that town, which had the star shining right above it, without any scorpions or snakes or hyenas getting her. And when she got to that town, she passed a sign telling her that this was the town of, I can't remember now, something beginning with B. Town of, and that's it, Bethlehem. She arrived at the town of Bethlehem. And she didn't need to ask people where 4 camels, 4 elephants and 4 horses might have got to, because there on the ground were the tracks of 4 camels, 4 elephants and 4 horses. Her family and all of those wise men, they were here in this little town of Bethlehem. So Elsie followed those tracks until she came to a stable. And at this stable, she saw 4 camels and 4 elephants and 4 horses and 12 wise men, and also a few shepherds and some sheep as well. They were all standing there looking very cross because Elsie was late. But there were some people there who didn't look quite so cross. That was a mum and a dad standing beside a cot where they were rocking a little baby. And the mother looked at Elsie and saw all the presents on Elsie's back and said, "Little camel, are those for my baby?" Well, Elsie knew that they were, so she came over and the wise men took the presents off her back and they gave the baby those presents of gold and frankincense and, what was the last one again? Myrrh, thank you. I always forget that one. And the myrrh. And as they were giving them to the baby, they said, "Here you are, baby Jesus." Elsie learned the name of that baby was Jesus. And after all of the presents had been given to that little baby Jesus, the mother, whose name was Mary, turned to Elsie and said, "Thank you, little camel." And Elsie had never heard those words before said to her. No one had ever said, "Thank you, little camel," ever before. And it made Elsie feel very warm inside. She felt the happiest she had ever been. But Mary didn't stop there. She said, "Little camel, you have done something so wonderful for us today, bringing these presents across the desert. I imagine it was very scary, and you kept going even though you were on your own. So I would like to ask you, little camel, if you could do an extra special job for me. You see, my baby boy here, he's a very special baby. And in the future, people are going to want to celebrate his birthday every single year for many, many hundreds of years into the future. They might even call it Christmas. On those days when we're celebrating the birth of baby Jesus, I would quite like presents to be taken to all of the good boys and girls. Could you do that for us, Elsie? Could you take presents to the good boys and girls at Christmas time? And Elsie thought about this. No one had offered her such an important job before, and it made her feel very proud. So she said yes. And ever since that day, in the hot parts of the world where reindeer don't like to go, the good children, the good boys and girls, they get presents delivered to them at Christmas time from Elsie, the little camel. That's why Father Christmas doesn't have to go all around the world to deliver his presents, because in those hot places, Elsie takes them instead. And you never know. If you ask Elsie really nicely, she might take you your presents this year. Thank you so much for sharing that story with us. Elsie was really brave at the end there, wasn't she? I think that's why that has to be one of my favourite stories ever. But Elsie isn't the only one who helps Father Christmas to share presents at Christmas time. I know another tale of a Christmas present giver, and I'll share it with you as a bonus story. All you need to do is have a go at my epic challenge. Have a look below for instructions on what to do. Right now, though, it only remains for us to say cheerio and happy Christmas. So, cheerio and happy cactus! Happy cactus?